It is often assumed that prisoner of war camps during the Second World War operated according to rigid, universally applied rulebooks with regulations neatly governing every aspect of captivity. The image many people carry is one of strict uniformity, standardized rations, standardized barracks, standardized procedures, all implemented without deviation. In reality, while the international conventions and military manuals provided frameworks, the daily administration of captivity was frequently shaped by circumstances the rulebooks had not fully anticipated. Among the most revealing examples were the rare cases involving female prisoners of war held in camps, primarily designed for men. These cases did not overturn the system, but they exposed its limits. By 1942, the detaining powers on both sides of the conflict were operating large, complex camp networks. The 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war established the broad principles: humane treatment, protection from violence and intimidation, adequate food and shelter, access to medical care, and the right to correspondence. Yet the convention was written largely with male combatants in mind. The overwhelming majority of captured soldiers were men, and administrative planning reflected that reality. In Europe, Germany administered a network of camps known as Stahls for enlisted personnel and Auflags for officers. In the United States, captured Axis soldiers were held in facilities scattered across the country, often in rural areas where agricultural labor was in demand. Britain operated its own system for Axis prisoners, while the Soviet Union managed vast camps for German and other enemy soldiers under conditions that differed significantly from Western standards. Across these systems, camp architecture, sanitation facilities, work assignments, and disciplinary procedures were designed around male populations. The appearance of a female prisoner of war in such an environment was statistically rare but administratively significant. Records suggest that women were most commonly captured in roles such as auxiliary personnel, resistance fighters treated as combatants, medical staff, or in certain cases members of anti-aircraft units or communication services. While the Geneva Convention stipulated that women should be treated with all regard due to their sex, it offered little practical guidance on how to house or supervise them within camps built exclusively for men. One case, documented in administrative correspondence from a European camp in 1944, illustrates the resulting tensions between regulation and reality. The woman in question was a uniformed member of her country's armed forces, captured during the retreat following an Allied advance. Camp records identify her only by surname and rank, and note her arrival among a transport of male prisoners. There is no indication of dramatic circumstances surrounding her capture. According to the intake register, she was processed in the same manner as the others, personal effects recorded, identification verified, and medical examination conducted. The difficulty began not at the gate but in the barracks. The camp's physical layout offered no separate accommodation for women. Its latrines were communal. Work details were organized by platoon-sized groups. Guards had been trained to supervise male prisoners under assumptions of male behavior and hierarchy. The camp commandant, according to correspondence preserved in regional archives, immediately sought clarification from higher authorities. He cited the Geneva Convention's requirement for separate sleeping quarters for female prisoners and asked whether transfer to a different facility was possible. The reply, which arrived weeks later, advised temporary segregation within the existing compound until a more permanent arrangement could be made. This instruction reveals an important aspect of wartime administration: communication delays, bureaucratic layering, and competing priorities often meant that ideal procedures could not be implemented swiftly. In the interim, the camp staff converted a small storage building near the infirmary into a makeshift dormitory. Contemporary accounts indicate that this arrangement was not primarily driven by sentiment, but by concern for order. Camp authorities feared that failure to provide separate quarters might invite accusations of misconduct, whether from prisoners, protecting powers such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, or post-war investigators. At the same time, they were conscious that excessive isolation could be interpreted as punitive treatment. The presence of a single female prisoner also complicated the medical system. Routine medical inspections were conducted by male military doctors, often with limited equipment. The camp's infirmary was accustomed to treating injuries, infectious diseases, and malnutrition among men. According to camp medical notes, special arrangements were made to ensure privacy during examinations. This required assigning a female nurse from a nearby civilian hospital to attend on specific days. The arrangement was irregular and dependent on transportation and availability. Such improvisation highlights the gap between convention and implementation. The Geneva Framework assumed that detaining powers would have both the capacity and the infrastructure to comply fully with its provisions. In practice, wartime shortages of personnel and resources often forced local commanders to adapt as best they could. Work assignments presented another challenge. Under the convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, provided the labor was not directly related to the enemy's war effort and was not dangerous or unhealthy. In camps across the United States, German prisoners worked on farms, in canneries, and in lumber camps. In Germany, Allied prisoners were assigned to factories and agricultural estates. The camp in this case operated several agricultural labor detachments, supplying nearby farms. The commandant faced a question: should the female prisoner be assigned to labor alongside male prisoners or exempted? Records suggest that higher authorities recommended that women not be compelled to perform heavy manual labor. As a result, she was assigned to clerical tasks within the camp administration, copying inventory lists and translating correspondence when language skills allowed. This decision was pragmatic. It reduced the need for close supervision in mixed work details and minimized potential friction. Witnesses later recalled that her presence was a matter of curiosity among other prisoners rather than open disruption. The camp's internal order relied heavily on prisoner self-administration under appointed senior non-commissioned officers. These internal hierarchies were delicate. The introduction of a woman into a male-dominated structure required careful management. Camp reports indicate that contact between her and other prisoners was limited to work-related interactions and controlled recreation periods. Recreation itself was another regulated domain. Camps encouraged sports, theatrical performances, and educational classes as a means of maintaining morale and discipline. However, the integration of a single woman into such activities was complicated. According to a Red Cross inspection summary from the period, she was permitted to attend lectures and religious services but sat separately. The language of the report is neutral, noting compliance with minimum standards and the absence of complaints at the time of inspection. It is important to emphasize that this case did not represent a general policy shift. Female prisoners remained rare enough that most camps never confronted the issue. Nevertheless, the existence of even a few such cases exposed the implicit gender assumptions embedded in the camp system. Barracks were designed for male bodies. Disciplinary regulations assumed male patterns of interaction. Even clothing supplies posed challenges, as standard-issue garments were cut for men. According to quartermaster logs, efforts were made to procure suitable clothing through civilian channels. Delays were common. In the interim, garments were altered by prisoners with tailoring experience. This practical detail, seemingly minor, reflects the broader improvisational character of wartime administration. The rulebook did not specify how to alter uniforms to fit a lone female captive. Camp staff and prisoners solved the problem locally. The psychological dimension, while less documented, can be inferred cautiously. Contemporary accounts indicate that camp authorities were concerned about protecting the female prisoner from harassment while also avoiding the perception of favoritism. Regulations prohibited fraternization between guards and prisoners. The presence of a woman heightened scrutiny of guard conduct. Internal memoranda warned personnel that any breach of discipline would have serious consequences. For the prisoner herself, surviving documentation is limited. A brief note in a repatriation file suggests that she remained in the camp until transferred to a larger facility with designated accommodation for women. There is no extended testimony describing her daily experiences. As historians, we must resist the temptation to fill these silences with imagined dialogue or inner reflection. What can be said with confidence is that her case required the camp administration to reconcile abstract legal principles with concrete, logistical constraints. Beyond this individual example, the broader issue of female prisoners of war reveals much about the Second World War's evolving character. As total war blurred the boundaries between front lines and home fronts, women increasingly served in uniformed capacities. Their capture challenged older military traditions that associated combatant status exclusively with men. Detaining powers were forced to interpret conventions written in an earlier era. In some theaters, women captured while participating in resistance activities were denied prisoner of war status altogether, classified instead as irregular fighters. In others, particularly within the Western Allied system, efforts were made to apply the Geneva Convention as written, albeit imperfectly. The uneven application underscores the importance of administrative culture and oversight mechanisms. The International Committee of the Red Cross played a critical role in monitoring conditions. Inspection reports from camps holding female prisoners often paid particular attention to sleeping arrangements, sanitation, and privacy. The presence of a woman could serve as a test case for a camp's overall adherence to standards. Where facilities were already strained, compliance was more difficult to achieve. By 1945, as the war drew to a close, the question of female prisoners remained marginal in numerical terms, but symbolically significant. Post-war legal reviews examined camp practices in light of international law. Cases involving women were scrutinized for evidence of abuse or neglect. In the majority of documented Western camps, available records indicate that authorities made efforts, however imperfect, to conform to convention requirements. The female POW case that did not match the camp rulebook was not an anomaly because of misconduct or scandal. It was anomalous because it revealed how much of the rulebook had been written with assumptions that no longer fully applied. The war had expanded the categories of those who served and those who were captured. Camp systems built for one demographic reality had to adjust to another. When we examine such cases, the value lies not in dramatizing individual hardship, but in understanding institutional response. The camp commandant who requested guidance was not acting outside the system. He was seeking to operate within it. The delays, improvisations, and partial solutions reflect the constraints of wartime governance. In the end, the historical significance of this case rests in its quiet demonstration that even highly regulated systems contain spaces of uncertainty. A single prisoner could expose the limitations of standardized procedures. Records suggest that adjustments were made, transfers arranged, and the situation normalized within bureaucratic parameters. There was no public controversy, no dramatic confrontation, and no sweeping reform. Yet for historians, such episodes illuminate the lived reality behind official texts. The Geneva Convention established principles. Camps attempted to implement them under pressure. The presence of women in captivity, however rare, compelled administrators to confront the human diversity that war inevitably produces. The Second World War is often remembered through sweeping narratives of battles and diplomacy. But it was also shaped by smaller administrative decisions made in offices and barracks far from the front lines. The female prisoner whose case did not match the camp rulebook stands as a reminder that systems designed for uniformity must adapt when confronted with difference. In that adaptation, we see both the strengths and the limitations of wartime institutions, POW mechanisms. There is no need to assign symbolic weight beyond what the evidence supports. Her experience does not overturn our understanding of prisoner of war policy, nor does it represent a hidden chapter of dramatic resistance. What it does reveal is that international law, military bureaucracy, and human circumstance intersected in ways that were sometimes unanticipated. As records suggest. By the time of her transfer, procedures had been clarified for handling similar cases. The rulebook itself did not change during the war, but its interpretation evolved. That evolution, gradual and administrative rather than revolutionary, reflects the broader story of how institutions respond to realities on the ground. In examining such cases, we are reminded that history is not only the story of grand strategy, but also of how systems cope with exceptions. The female POW who did not fit the camp's design did not dismantle the structure. Instead, her presence prompted adjustments that reveal the practical workings of wartime captivity. Through these quiet adjustments, we gain a clearer understanding of how rules functioned, where they strained, and how they were applied to individuals who did not neatly conform to their original assumptions.